Philippians. You've got notes, but I'm not necessarily going to follow precisely the notes. This whole thing with Philippians for this episode started with Dean, whether you remember it or not. Dean and I were talking one day, and she said to me, "What is your favorite book of the Bible?" And without even hesitating, I said, Philippians. Uh, Philippians is obviously Paul's favorite book, or I should say, the people of Philippi were Paul's favorite friends. You read the letter, just 4 chapters, you can do it in 15 minutes, but you read it and you know with what deep affection Paul held the people of Philippi. Uh, so let's do some background on all of this stuff. First of all, I need to we've talked about this before, but I want you to put your thinking cap on just a little bit. Here in the 21st century, when we read the Philippians or any part of the Bible, without thinking, we read it for now. We read it for us now. Uh, and that is the typical way that we do. Whatever year we live in, if you read a text or anything like that, you tend to read it now. And I say we read it backward. We start here where it is today, and then we push ourselves back to try to decide what it was when the whole thing started. Well, in biblical studies, for me, for a long time, I have tried to start where it starts and go forward rather than reading it back. And the typical Bible study takes it for today, which is perfectly okay. And we try to see what the message might mean for us today, which is perfectly legitimate. But it tends to be devotional. Uh, and in many ways, I think uh, misses the impact of what something like this great little letter to the Philippians really is all about. So, what I want to try to do with all 4 of these chapters, and particularly today with background, and we'll see how far we get with it, is to try to start with them. Start with the people of Philippi, okay? And read forward. We want to try to understand the book. We can't, but we can try to understand this letter as if we were the people in Philippi in the little bitty house church that Paul was trying to start. They get this letter, and what did it mean to them? Uh, we could also talk about why they kept it. We think that Paul wrote a lot of letters. They, of course, and you well know they didn't have any other means of communicating. You could talk or you could write a letter. It took a long time for these letters to move around. There was no rapid post service, you know, all of that. So Paul wrote what did, what was the message that Paul was writing, and what was the culture, the milieu into which he wrote, into which these people lived. Okay. So we're going to try, you can't, well, we're going to try to get this story uh, from 2,000 years ago and and get that and then do it. My great Marcus Borg friend writer says to get there then and our now. And the better we get there then, the more clearly we can get our now. Okay. So it's not just an exercise for seminary or something like that to try to do the history and the background. It is to try to understand what Paul wanted them to understand. Paul had no idea that his letter to them would be read in January 2025. He had no idea. He wrote a letter. He wrote his dear friends a letter. He had an agenda in writing that letter, but he wrote them a letter. Okay. So we're going to try to push ourselves back to them. Now, come in. We have a paper right there that you can get and take a chair. The no save seats. Okay. Uh, so let's back up now. And what was Philippi? The town Philippi. Uh, it's in, as you see from the map on your page there, it's up in Macedonia, Greece, Macedonia. So you can kind of locate it on the map there on the notes that I gave you. Long about 500 BCE, a very, very long time ago, there was a little village in this part of the world up there in Macedonia was founded. I don't know why it was founded, but it was just a little village. A few decades later, Saddam, who was the Philip of Macedon, was the king of Macedonia. You don't have to remember all that, but he was creating a kingdom, and as he expanded his kingdom, he went and took this little town, which was really part of Macedonia, nearby his place there, and renamed it after himself. He renamed it Philippi. He was Philip, and so he named it Philippi. The reason we remember that is he was the father of Alexander the Great. Uh, Philip of Macedon was a hard driving uh, guy that was creating a kingdom and was doing well. He had a bunch of children, bunch of that kind of stuff that they did in those days. And his son was Alexander. When Alexander was either 18 or 19 years old, young man, beautiful, favored, everything that a young Greek god could have, Alexander had. One of Philip's soldiers, for reasons that I forget, killed him, assassinated him, stabbed him. He killed the king. He rose up in a banquet or something and stabbed and killed King Philip, which immediately made Alexander the king of Macedonia. So that was the succession that was going on there. What I have learned reading all this stuff, near Philippi, they found gold mines. They found some gold. And of course, Philip and then his son Alexander immediately began to mine the gold, which funded their huge military operation. You know the story of Alexander. He conquered the world, and he extended Greek culture throughout the Mediterranean world. And he died at 33 of a disease or something killed him. But by then he had conquered much of the known world. He had gone all the way to India. He'd gone all the way down to Egypt. He was an extraordinary military commander. He, against all odds, defeated the Persian Empire, one of the great series of battles in antiquity, and defeated the Persian Empire. And so he's called Alexander the Great because he was great. He was a military guy. He was ruthless, strong, beautiful, handsome, but he was also very cultured. And he wanted to extend Greek culture and the Greek language to the world that he conquered. And out of all of that, for centuries, Greek became the major language of the Mediterranean world. And parenthetically from all of that, that is why the New Testament is written entirely in Greek. Different flavors of Greek, the different flavors of Greek, like we have different flavors of English, but Greek became the lingua franca of the Mediterranean world because of Alexander. It's on and on and on. He founded the great city of Alexandria, Egypt. Uh, and started what became the Great Alexandrian Library, which for 300 or 400 years contained the knowledge of the world. Some of the earliest extant writings of Hebrew scripture was in the Alexandrian Library. On down the line, the Syria had earthquakes in the on into the common era, our era, earthquakes, and then stupid kings. They destroyed over time. They destroyed the library, and all of that learning with it, which was a real tragedy. But anyway, so Philippi, Philippi, named for Philip of Macedon. It was a town of when Paul got there. They say probably 25 or 30,000 people there. Philippi is famous for another reason entirely. In high school, how many of you read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar? Did y'all read that? I didn't. Our school didn't know it existed, but I have since read that many times. Uh, so Julius Caesar, Philippi, all of that. Uh, Caesar, you know the story generally. He became the great ruler of Rome and a lot of stuff. And uh, he he in effect declared himself consul for life, which really made him dictator for life in Rome over the Roman Empire. Uh, and then may close this. It's Julius Caesar was assassinated on March 11th, the Ides of March in 44 BCE. Cassius Brutus and a bunch of guys got together and decided that Julius Caesar was becoming too powerful and too smart and was threatening the life of Rome, threatening the whole way of life for Rome. And so on that famous Ides of March, they attacked him in the Senate and killed him, murdered him. So, uh, and then the way Julius Caesar tells, I mean, the way Shakespeare tells the story, uh, becomes the famous speech by Mark Antony. Uh, they gathered on the steps of the Senate, ostensibly to bury Caesar and to make it okay that he had been assassinated. You know, that was the squiggle that was going on. But Mark Antony's speech says, "I have not come to bury Caesar, but to celebrate." I forget to praise him. Forget the whole language there. Uh, that the murder of Julius Caesar created yet another civil war in the Roman world. Before Caesar died, uh, he had daughters but no sons. And so before he died, in his will, he named his nephew, his maybe great nephew, Octavian, his heir. He adopted Octavian as his son and made him his heir. Octavian was 18 or 19 years old, a slender young man. People wondered, they didn't know that till the will was read. And Octavian had become Caesar's heir. Uh, you know, 18, 19 years old, obviously a savvy, smart young kid, but apparently in the eyes of Julius Caesar, saw something of greatness or quality or strength in Octavian that he wanted to encourage. So Octavian ultimately, years later, we'll fill you in the blanks a minute, became Caesar Augustus. Octavian had his name changed by the Senate and he became Caesar Augustus, Augustus the mighty one, the first one, the principal one. Caesar was the family name. So he was Caesar uh, Augustus. He was of the family of Caesar, which went back to the founding of Rome, and the Senate gave him the title Augustus, which was the revered one. Okay, so Uh, but in the midst of all that, there was a big civil war. And this again is a part of the play of Julius Caesar. Uh, Brutus, the famous line in Shakespeare, "Et tu, Brutus." Brutus stabbed him, and in the play, before Caesar dies, he looks up. He had loved Brutus. Brutus had loved him. Brutus was very fond of Julius Caesar, but became frightened that Caesar was becoming too powerful. So this cabal was created, Caesar, Cassius, and a bunch of them, and they killed Julius Caesar. They murdered Caesar. So the killers of Julius Caesar had to be avenged. And so Octavian, he was still Octavian, still a young man, 23, 24, by Octavian, and the famous Mark Antony, ultimately with Cleopatra, you know that. And another guy who totally disappears named Lepidus formed a triumvirate to avenge the death of Julius Caesar, and also to provide leadership for Rome. The empire was not yet. It existed in name, but not officially. But by then, Rome had conquered much of the Mediterranean world. So anyway, uh, so then I'm getting to Philippi. The battle raged back and forth. Caesar died in 44. He was murdered in 44. In October of 42 BCE, uh, the great battle for the future of Rome was joined at Philippi, near the city of Philippi. Brutus and Cassius and their league came up against Octavian and Mark Antony in what is called the Battle of Philippi in October of 42. At first, it looked like Mark Antony and Octavian had been defeated. Huge, huge war, huge, thousands and thousands of troops just converged. Battles take their own life. Nobody meant to fight the Battle of Gettysburg, but that's where it happened. So they were all at Philippi, uh, and the battle lasted the whole month of October. Finally, Mark Antony, who at that point was a very smart guy, uh, militarily, he failed miserably later, but he was a great military guy there. He defeated Brutus and Cassius. Brutus and Cassius both committed suicide. That's what you did if you lost the war. Uh, before the way Shakespeare sets it up, before the battle was joined, Brutus is talking with his chief military guy. I don't remember that, and gives the great lines that have become a part of me for much of my adult life. When Brutus said to maybe the Cassius, one of them, as they anticipated the come out, the ultimate of the battle, he says, "There is a time in the affairs of men which, when taken at the full, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures." Uh, I use that a whole lot. I've given my grandsons that. I tell myself that you have those moments. You have those moments, and and you take the moments, and they don't always work out like, but you take the moment. Uh, there is a time in the tides of men which, taken at the full, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyages of their life is lived out in misery. So that's in the play. I don't. Brutus probably didn't say that. Uh, he probably thought it, but he didn't say it. Anyway, Brutus and Cassius lost. Both committed suicide. Octavian then goes to battle Mark Antony. Mark Antony falls in love with Cleopatra. Then the great battle of Actium, a sea battle, Actium in 30 somewhere, 34, 5 CE, BCE, settles it that Mark Antony and Cleopatra are defeated, and Octavian by then is the clear ruler of the Roman world, and he ultimately becomes Caesar Augustus and creates the Roman Empire. And he is the first Roman emperor. The word is imperator, and we translate that emperor. So Caesar Augustus became the first Roman emperor. And it is that Caesar Augustus that the Gospel of Luke talks about. Luke says in the days of Caesar Augustus, he ordered that the whole Roman Empire should be registered. So he enters history as an appendage to the birth of Jesus, which is one of the delightful ironies of world history. Uh, he thought he was the master, and in effect, he died, went away when he was in his old age in about 24 CE. He ruled a long time. He's gone. Jesus is still here. One of those great ironies of history. So all of that's just fun for me. I hope it's not too boring for you. Anyone about to catch up here? You sort of see the drift here, and I hope it's useful to set up what's happening here. Okay, so this is in the 40s and 30s BCE, before the Common Era. Okay, about 100 years later, in like uh, oh uh, 40 Common Era somewhere, we don't really know. Paul sets out to to bring the gospel of Jesus to non-Jews. This is well known. This is Paul's calling. Um, who was Paul? We've talked about this a whole lot. Paul, very smart young guy, did not bear fools easily. Very, very bright. Apparently from a family of some substance, from Tarsus, not in Jerusalem, but out in the Mediterranean. Apparently along the way, uh, Paul's father, whoever he was, sends Saul, he was Saul in those days, to Jerusalem to study the Jewish ways, to become a real scholar, a real leader among the Pharisees. He calls himself a Pharisee. So Paul along in there somewhere, we don't know. The Bible does not tell us. Paul does not mention it. I sort of think that I give a rather arbitrary date for the death of Jesus on the cross in about 30 Common Era, 30 AD, 30 Common Era. That's arbitrary. Could be more or less. Jesus died on the cross somewhere along in there. And then I speculate that Paul was a few years younger than Jesus. Jesus 30, 33 when he died. So Paul 20, 25 or somewhere in here when Jesus died. Uh, Paul says that he never saw Jesus in the flesh. He never saw Jesus with his eyes. A lot of stuff in there began to happen that we don't know. The New Testament simply, it was not what we would like to know, was not important to the story of Jesus at that particular time. But particularly the activity of Paul that unfolds triggers my imagination about what was going on at that particular time. And it's worthwhile to try to figure out, because whatever it was going on affects us today. I mean, out of that came, out of that milieu, out of that whatever it was, came the church. It was not the church, it was a club, it was a movement. but it became what we now call the Christian church. Apparently, when Jesus had died, and people immediately began to grieve, this wonderful man of God had died, had been crucified. They wanted to try to figure out why he died. They didn't know why he died. Why, then the theological question arises, why would God allow this wonderful young man who was so full of God, who had such wisdom and savvy, had some capacity to heal people, anything that anybody could have wanted, Jesus had. And suddenly he was gone. He was dead. He'd been crucified. Interestingly enough, even the New Testament Gospels do not say why he died. You can speculate, but the New Testament stories, the Gospels, really do not tell why Jesus died. Why he died became a part of the theology, and particularly the Christology of Paul, that has so shaped our thinking for these last couple of thousand years. But apparently, the life and death of Jesus, and then the word began to get out that God had raised him from the dead. So Jesus had died, and then the word was out in Jerusalem that God had raised him from the dead. Now, that seems startling to us, but great notable people in that era, with some regularity, word got out that he was raised from the dead. Nero had that language. Julius Caesar had that language. There are episodes in the prophets when dead people came back to life. Uh, Elijah, Elisha, and even Jesus, according to the Gospels, raised a couple of people, Lazarus and the daughter of the centurion. So for us, it is very unique to think somebody coming back to life who has been certified dead. But that's the way they told it in those days. And the way that it frequently happened would be Dean would be talking with Mary, and Dean would say, I was talking with Sammy the other day, and he heard from Rita that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And so from Dean to Mary to Sammy to Rita, the story develops. And because it was not uncommon, if somebody said that today, we would say, no, that doesn't happen. But in that day, it could happen. See, it could happen. Like who saw angels? Again, I've said this before. Dean said her uncle told her that Sammy had seen an angel. So by then it is Dean and Mary and Sammy and Linda and Rita and everybody has seen an angel. So it just becomes etched. There's a really neat little mantra uh, that helps me and stuff like this. We go from experience to metaphor to dogma. Rita has a vision. She has a vision of the risen Jesus. It's a vision. She's asleep or however visions come. So Rita has the experience. Then she tries to explain to Linda what her vision was. And because language is limited, Rita would say, it was like I was awake. I had a dream of my Linda last night. She was shopping, which is very, very typical of Linda. She loved to shop. I had that. Uh, so I had a vision of Linda last night. So Rita tells Linda she had a vision of Jesus. Linda then tells Sammy, my friend Rita had this vision. Sammy says, this is too good to let go. So Sammy grabs up his laptop and writes it down. And suddenly it's etched. Suddenly it is printed. And once it becomes printed, we have a hard time saying it didn't really happen. It becomes dogma, it becomes theology, it becomes doctrine. And so I think a lot of these wonderful events out of the life of Jesus occurred like that because it is a common way to try to deal with the what we would call the epiphenomenal. Paul had visions, and I have said before that visions were legitimate. Uh, Rita had a vision of the risen Jesus. Now, Rita is known in town as not a crackpot. She's not a crackpot. Uh, she might do funny things every now and then, but she's not a crackpot. And so she's at a meeting of whatever it is, the sewing circle, and she says, "The other night I had a vision of the risen Jesus." And everybody says, "Wow, that's wonderful." We depend on Rita. We know she's telling us what she had, and she may well have had a vision of the risen Jesus. Paul had at least the Damascus Road vision. He talks about it differently in the book of Galatians, but he had a vision of the risen Jesus. He had some other very important visions also that become very important to start with. I keep leaning over here because that sun, it won't go away up out of that upper window up there. So Paul he's persecuting the church, that famous story in Acts, and he says it in several places in his letters. He didn't like what they were doing. He saw it as opposed to classic historic Judaism. So it made him real nervous. And he says he began to really give the Jesus people in Jerusalem a hard time. And then the way the book of Acts tells it, he was on his way to Damascus to give them trouble up there. Uh, and that's when he had his major vision of the risen Jesus. And it was that vision that galvanized Paul. Probably what we know of psychology and the way we respond by the time Paul had that vision on the Damascus Road, he was already churning because he was seeing stuff in Jerusalem among otherwise really faithful Jews who were responding to their own memory, their own experience with Jesus. So anyway, the Damascus, so-called Damascus Road, was that great catalyst that persuaded Paul that he had to not to renounce Judaism, but on the basis of his Judaism and on the basis of one of those major streams that God would someday bring back a Messiah who would restore David's kingdom. And all of that stuff was flowing there. And so Paul began to say that Jesus was that Messiah. Uh, People were obviously already talking about it. We don't know all of that. We don't know what all of that is. But in the midst of all of that, and this is years, this is evolutionary process for Paul, he began to decide and began to listen to some of the great passages out of his own scripture, Isaiah and places like that, when God talks about uh, the word of God being not only for the Jews, but for the nations, for the Gentiles. So Paul hears that, uh, which made a lot of his own good friends, some of whom were Jesus people by then, as you know, very uncomfortable that this new thing of Jesus would be not just for Jews. There was no notion at that early stage that the Jews would be cut out. But in addition to the Jews, in addition to the sons of Abraham, the word of God, the gospel of God, the gospel of love and compassion and inclusion was for everybody. So this, I'm persuaded, this takes a while. This is years. Paul is maybe in his early 20s when all this began to churn in him. And no doubt it took him a while. Can't you imagine what his father said? Dad, he writes his daddy, uh, I need some money because I'm going to go out and preach to non-Jews. And his father would say, what are you, what are you talking about? It would be, that's what typically the father would say. Would that happen? Probably not. Uh, but it was very different, very radical. And what ultimately Paul did, his preaching, was to call into question at least 500 years of Judaism. Paul never did stop being a Jew. He was Jewish all the way through. He talks about this, in Galatians, Corinthians, he gives his whole litany of bona fides that make him a Jew. But in a but he understood Jesus the Jew to be something new that he wanted to talk about. So that brings us up to kind of where we are with the book of Philippians. Okay. Is that too much? Is that uh, no, no, no. I don't think any. My hunch is that none of the knew each other. Uh, you had to put some dates on it. Uh, Paul was executed. I mean, a really good tradition. Paul and Peter were killed by Nero in the middle 60s. And the book of Mark then comes out in the late 60s, early 70s. Paul killed in Rome. We don't know who Mark was. We don't know where Mark wrote. We don't know to whom he wrote. But some years after Paul was off the scene, the book of Mark emerges. So who knows? But not any scholars that I read would make Paul and Mark know each other. The same thing I think is true. I don't think that any of the gospel writers knew each other. We do know that Matthew and Luke had access to Mark's gospel, not to Mark, whoever he was. But by then, uh, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, 90s, early hundreds, their stuff was moving around in the developing Jesus movement. And so uh, Matthew and Luke, pretty clear. I mean, that scholars are just about unanimous in saying that Matthew and Luke had access to Mark's gospel and used the big framework of Mark's gospel to write their gospels. And then they added a lot of other stuff to it that we don't know where they got it either, but that, yeah. Uh, so the Gospels are Matthew. I mean, the Gospels really in order of writing are Mark, clearly the youngest, Matthew, John, and Luke. The way I do it, Mark, Matthew, Luke. Back up. Mark, Matthew, John, Luke. The better scholarship, newer scholarship, puts the Gospel of Luke into the early part of the second century. So it's the last one. People will debate whether it's Luke or John, but I like the people who make Luke late in there. Uh, so Paul starts out. Uh, he starts out, and the Book of Acts gives us some insights into Mark's activity. Into Paul's activity. Uh, it's helpful to me to agree that the Book of Acts is stylized history. None of it meets the standard of history in the modern era. They did not write with all the sources and all that we have these days. They all had an agenda. They were all written by somebody They had a purpose. That I mean they were not reliable, but they told it largely their own way also. Uh, and so you kind of get down into all of that. Paul begins, this is the book of Acts, but Paul feels a distinct call to preach, to tell the good news of Jesus uh, to non-Jews, to Gentiles, to Goys, as I think the Hebrew is to Goys, to Goya, uh, which was very disturbing. You read the book of Acts, and they had big debates about this, whether whether people who followed Jesus, non-Jews who followed Jesus, had to practice all the ways of Judaism, circumcision, the food laws, purity laws, all of that kind of stuff. Did they have to do this? And Paul very marvelously said, no, you don't have to do that. You can do it if you want to. He didn't say don't do it, but he said it is not required to be a follower of Jesus to keep all of those rules and regulations. So uh, then the book of Acts gives us clues, if not actual datable history all the way through, gives us the larger the picture, the general outline of the way Paul and two or three of his friends began to go out beyond Judaism and talk with, preach to, begin to share the word of God through Jesus with non-Jews, and which was a big deal, big thing there. The book of Acts gives all kinds of insights into that. Philip, not any related to our Philip here, uh, is Philip meets the Ethiopian eunuch. That's a famous story in the book of Acts. Uh, and so he preaches to him, and the Ethiopian eunuch becomes a believer and is baptized by the side of the road there. Uh, so Paul starts out, uh, and he's in. You look at your map; it doesn't quite show it. Uh, he's in what he preaches primarily initially to in towns in what is now Turkey. It was called Asia Minor in the Roman Empire, over off to the right, to the east of the Mediterranean Sea. So he starts out over there. He knew that area. He had friends there. Uh, so he starts talking and preaching off over there. Uh, a time or two, he wanted to go in another direction. Then he says, the Spirit prevented. Another little piece of Acts that is so fascinating is suddenly it is not just Paul, it is us. The we is added. We don't know who the we is. Traditionally, the we is Luke, but people, I'm not so sure about that. Again, the better scholarship questions whether that friend of Paul's was our Luke of the Gospels and Acts, but that's another story there. Uh, but suddenly it's we, not just Paul, me, but them, it's we. But anyway, so Paul then has a vision. He's in the Asia Minor city of Troas. He'd already wanted to push different directions, and the language is the Spirit prevented him from doing that. Uh, and so he has a vision, has a dream, and in the dream, it is a man from Macedonia. You look at your map, my little map that I gave you, Macedonia, which pushes him to Philippi. Here we are after all this long journey here. Paul goes to Philippi. Uh, and in the what is the Macedonian dream? And what is the dream that he has in Troas? Remember that? It is the dream of a man from Macedonia saying, come over and help us. Paul has the dream at night. I says it's a dream. at night. A man from Macedonia says, "Come over and help us." And immediately Paul and Silas and Timothy, his two big buddies, get a boat and sail over to Philippi. Philippi was on the coast. Uh, why did they go to Philippi? Maybe they had friends there. We don't know why he went to Philippi. The distinction is that the mission in Philippi is the first time the gospel, and this is the way the Bible tells it, is the first time the gospel of Jesus is preached in Europe. Philippi, Macedonia, and all that was regarded as part of Europe. And so uh, that's the salient thing there is that the gospel suddenly has crossed the Aegean Sea, all those other little islands in there, uh, and Paul is preaching the gospel in Europe. Who is the first person that Paul meets when he gets to Philippi? Huh?
Lydia.
Who?
Talking about Lydia.
Lydia. Exactly right. What did Lydia do? What was her job? She, right. She was what the Bible is, a seller of purple. Purple cloth was highly valued. It was cloth, real fine cloth. I think it used a mollusk or at least some kind of little animal, a little fish or something that they could make the purple dye from. And not everybody could do that, but apparently Lydia either learned how to do it or anyway managed to create a business selling purple. It's a gorgeous story how Paul goes. He and his friends are looking for a place to worship, and they go to a river, and there they find Lydia and her friends praying by the river there, and in the story there, Lydia invites them, or Paul invites himself to be part of that prayer group. Lydia is converted, and so Lydia becomes the first person in Europe, according to these stories, to believe in Jesus. So a woman, a businesswoman, is the first European convert to the gospel of Jesus. Really, really startling there. A beautiful, beautiful picture there of that. And then she invites Paul to come stay with her. And Paul does that. Paul and Timothy and Silas go and stay with her. Paul gets in trouble. He gets all tangled up with a business proposition. Hello. Uh, and a young girl has the gift of divination. She can tell fortunes. And the story is, and we'll stop here. The girl sees Paul, hears his message, and pleads with Paul to free her from the demon that is possessing her, that enables her to tell fortunes. And so the story is Paul prays over this young girl, and the demon leaves her. Whatever the demon is, the ability to tell fortunes leaves her, which infuriates the girl's owner. She must be a slave girl. Paul's freeing of the young girl now from this demon of being able to tell fortunes, infuriates her owners who were making money off of her. And so they cause a lot of trouble. They cause a civil disturbance. And that's when Paul and Silas are arrested and put in the Philippian jail. This is all in Acts. Put in the Philippian jail. And then this beautiful story is in the middle of the night, Paul and Silas chained in the Philippian jail, which is very unfortunate because Paul is a Roman citizen and his rights as a Roman citizen were violated and all that. And that's when the earthquake comes, the story in Acts, an earthquake comes and their shackles are broken off. Suddenly they're freed, and the the Roman jailer, the Philippian jailer comes and sees all of his people free, and he is about to commit suicide because his prisoners are all freed. And Paul cries out, "No, don't do that. We're all here." Uh, and that's when the Philippian jailer says, famous line in Acts, "What must I do? What must I do to be saved?" And that's when Paul gives his famous, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, you and your household." So another story there. So that is Paul's entry. That is Paul's initial experience with Philippi, with the people of Philippi. Now, the letter that we have here comes some years after that. Paul has already worked there. He spent time there. He spent time in jail. Lydia, all of those pieces there that we pick up from Acts. Uh, Paul is there. He leaves to go to another town. And then in the early 50s, people pretty well speculate 52, 53, something like that, common era. They date Paul's beautiful letter to the Philippians. So we'll talk. That's probably more than you wanted to know, but that we'll set up here, and we'll do all of that next week to look at specifically at what was happening in Philippi, what was happening, what triggered all of that, really fill it in. And we'll also invariably and it have to talk about Roman religion. Rome was a very religious empire, if you understand what they meant by religion. Really, really endemic in the Roman Empire was this idea of religion. So we'll pick up there next week. Okay, that's sort of the what probably, probably could well be. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, and not just anybody knew how to do that. And so whatever the process was, Lydia knew how to do it, and one would imagine was a woman of substance. And women didn't often have business.
They could have lapis. They could have ground the lapis to get the purple.
I think I think a worm or a bug or something is the source of at least a part of that making of purple. You have to look that up on Google. Uh, but the whole thing unfolds. So that is to say that the letter that we have here to the people of Philippi did not just happen. Paul just didn't sit down one day and say, "I think I'll write my friends over." There was a process. There was a life, a whole understanding there. And so what we want to try to do is to put ourselves in the place of those people, Roman citizens, Roman people, Greek Macedonian people in the big town of Philippi with religion on every corner in every house. And suddenly Paul comes along and begins to tell them of something new. And apparently a number of them believed, accepted what Paul was saying, and they created a church, a house church, which really in the vernacular would be a club. They created a Jesus club. That would be the assembly, the ecclesia that we talk about translating church would be better probably translated club or assembly. So that was what they did. But then next week we'll look at this. So you can take 15 minutes and read the first chapter of Philippians, and then ask yourself questions. If this was the first time that you had ever read this letter, what jumps out at you? Try not to see it from 2021, but from 50 CE. Try to see how new and startling and provocative it was in those days.